But I'd like to get to know you. Yes, I would. But I'd like to get to know you if I could.
But I never will forget that as long as I live. That was about 67, 68.
Went up to, no one hardly got backstage there. So I walked up to Reba McIntyre. I said, Miss Reba, you don't know me. My name is Ben Cagle. I said, there's two women that I've really loved in my lifetime. This is one, my wife, and you're the other. Give me a big hug. And she said, come here, darling.
Oh, you remember Big Euless Bettis with the Chattanooga Police Department?
Yeah.
I said, Euless, I said, Johnny Cash just gave me the keys to his car. I said, there it sits. I said, you go park it. At least an officer will know where they put it so they can go back there and tell him where his car is.
Your host, retired Senior Hamilton County Commissioner Curtis Adams.
Well, I've certainly looked forward to this broadcast. I've had some great guests. I've had 32 people on this program. I'm going to a restaurant, somebody come over and mention it to me, but this is something I've always wanted to do, never thought I'd have an opportunity, and that's interview a radio legend in Chattanooga, Earl Freudenberg. He interviewed me many times on his program when I was a county commissioner, but this is sort of turning around. It's going to be very interesting. Earl's got a great background, been around a lot, met a lot of great people, and has a great career in radio. 50 years. That's a long time, but he's well respected, and we're going to find out some things about him maybe you hadn't heard about. One thing I want to ask him about, how to get involved with gospel music. He's always been known in Hamilton County and Chattanooga as the guy promoting gospel music. And so there's so many good things about him. Earl, it's so good to have you on our program, honoring you on your 50th anniversary.
I'm honored to be on your program.
50 years is a long time, isn't it?
50 years. Started back June the 2nd, 1962. I think it was a Saturday at the old WAPO. My dad and Gus Chamberlain, I'm sure you remember Gus.
Yeah.
They graduated from Baylor together, and Dad called Gus and said, my son is a little wacko. He wants to go into radio. Gus says, come on down. And Gus fixed me up. They gave me $5 a week. I helped Gus with the lookouts, the away games. When the game was broadcast, it would come in over a little ticker. And my job was to tear that off a half inning at a time and take it to Gus, who was in the other room, and to keep his scoreboard for both the Major League and the Southern League. And, of course, they let me file records, too. And they gave me a brand new $5 bill that first week I worked, and I went across the street to the S&W, bought me 3 chicken legs, mashed potatoes with gravy roll, and iced tea, and I thought I was Harv Bradley. I thought I was a big-time broadcaster.
It's amazing how you remember that and remember what you ate that day.
Well, they had a special. They had a special over there. Get 3 pieces of chicken.
And that was at the S&W?
S&W. You remember the S&W downtown?
Oh, yeah. I wish it was still there, don't you? Hey, I want to, before I get wound up on all these great things I want to talk about, I want to ask you, I know about it, but I want you to tell us about your family, your wife. You got a beautiful wife. And tell us a little bit about your family and your children, where you go to church.
Well, my family...
I know your mother, by the way, great pianist.
My family are native Chattanoogans. In fact, a lot of people, I guess the question that I've had asked me more than anything else, are you related to the Freudenbergs that ran the grocery store in North Chattanooga? And the answer is yes. Over there in the 300 block, 400 block, right across from Jody Kissinger's Northside Cleaners, and the Freudenberg grocery store was there for many, many years. And my father, after they closed the store, my father went to work for DuPont and retired from DuPont. So the second question I'm asked, are you the son of Charles Freudenberg that retired from DuPont? And I say yes. But Charles and Norma Freudenberg and the Freudenberg family, they all from Chattanooga. They're native from around here. This is the only place we've ever lived. And in 1969, I met a young lady, Julie Brown, and the Brown family, known around Red Bank. We got married, and we have 2 children. We have Amy, and we have Mark, and Amy has given us 2 granddaughters. And my dad's deceased, but Mom and my brother are residents at St. Barnabas Nursing Home, and Mother plays the piano down there 3 times a week. The only thing I can play is the radio.
I remember your dad well, too, Earl. You know, I came over at the Park Ridge when he was real sick. You called
sure
me, and I
did.
came over in the emergency room.
You stood by me faithfully.
Yes, sir, and
you sure did.
And I was proud to do that. And of course, I met your mother up there at the church on several occasions, and she was a sweet person and a good piano player.
Well, she's multi-talented. She started out, my grandfather told me that she had her first music lesson when she was 7, but he also sent her to music lessons, and I don't know who the teacher was, but she played the violin.
Really?
And then when she came to Calvary Bible Church, John Lanham one day, they didn't have an organ player, and John, you know how John is, he snapped his fingers and pointed toward the organ. So that began a 20-year career of Mother playing the organ. So she plays the violin, she plays the piano, and she plays the organ.
Didn't she play some at the First Nazarene Church?
Many, many years. In fact, that's how all of this radio stuff really got started, because back in the 50s, First Church of the Nazarene had a big presence on radio. They had the Nazarene Hour on Sunday afternoon on WDOD at 1 o'clock, and then they had the Challenge to Youth broadcast on Sunday night at a little after 10 o'clock, after the news, I believe. And Merrill Parker, a lot of people remember Merrill Parker. He was the first engineer for Ben Haden and changed lives. But Merrill Parker would come to the church on Sunday afternoon, and he would bring in the equipment, or I would go help him. I would go out. I was always waiting there on Willow Street for Mr. Parker and his little Studebaker to bring the equipment in, and I would help him set that equipment up. And you remember Wayne Smith, and I know you remember Bill Knowles. Both of them would say, now, don't get in Mr. Parker's way. And Mr. Parker would say, Earl knows more about this stuff than I do. But I would thread the tape, set the microphones up, and I knew when I was a kid in grammar school that I wanted to be in broadcasting.
Well, you've done well. You know, another Freudenberg I liked was your son. I got to know him real well when he came down to the tire store to have, do something on his car, buy some tires.
He bought a few sets of tires
He
and
did,
helped the
and
Adams family buy groceries.
And he's a great kid. I mean, he's real smart. He
Yeah.
sit up there in my office, and it's like talking to a 40-year-old man. I mean, he's a real smart guy.
Mark's very knowledgeable, but he does have some health issues, and unfortunately, that keeps him in a lot. But he does have a sharp mind.
But he was a sharp young guy. He certainly was. Before I forget it, Earl, I want to read a letter, if it's all right with you. I've got several things I want to talk about, but I want to read you a letter that you received from Ben Haden.
One of my favorite people.
I just thought it was a great letter. I mean, August the 31st, 2005. Dear Earl, if I had known you for the last 30 years, I sincerely feel I would know you intimately from listening for the last 30 years. You wear many hats: disc jockey, journalist, editorialist, commentator, conversationalist. It is impossible to listen to you without knowing what you are and who you are. In your many roles, you have never avoided subjects, never talked down to people, and never revealed anything other than fairness. You are a master at dealing with those of different opinion. You genuinely convey appreciation of the different view. When we listen to you, we feel closer to you, to the Lord, closer to the culture of our region, and closer to our country. You are a credit to Christ, to the Christ you confess, and to the people you so faithfully serve as a friend we can trust. Charlene joins me. Our regret is that we can't be with you. Warm personal regards, Ben Haden. Now, I think that was a great letter. I bet you not many people have a letter like that from Ben Haden.
I remember when Ben Haden came to First Presbyterian Church, he succeeded Dr. Fowle, and of course we broadcast the service. And I told Ben one time, I said, I probably have heard more of your sermons, but never have been in your auditorium to listen to you. And he had to think a minute. Oh yeah, you're back at the radio station putting First Presbyterian Church's Sunday morning service on the air. So naturally you would hear my Sunday morning service. He said, you probably have heard more of my sermons than some of my best members who are there every Sunday. But I cherish those comments and try to live up to what Ben says in that letter. I really do.
Well, he's a great man. He was up at Lee Anderson's thing. He still looks good.
Mm-hmm.
He's past 80 now, isn't he?
I think he's 85, 86.
But he don't look it, and he don't act it. But he's always been a great asset to Chattanooga, and we had a closeness to him at the newspaper because he was a former newspaper man.
Oh, he loves.
He was general manager of a newspaper. I can't remember the city.
In Bristol and Kingsport.
Yeah,
I believe.
Kingsport. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and then he decided to go into ministry. The Lord called him into the ministry, and then he went down to Florida, and then next thing you know, is in Chattanooga. But isn't it wonderful that we have been able to get people like that in Chattanooga, Tennessee?
He's a credit
From
to this
somewhere
community.
else. I mean, we had Ben Haden come in from somewhere else. We had Lee Robson come in from Birmingham, Alabama. Just think about what a change they had made in this city. Those
Sure
two
did.
preachers, well respected, known all over the country. Ben Haden had that radio program for years. Lee Robson traveled all over the country promoting the school and the church. So we had two great people, and Ben Haden was always such a humble fellow. I went to see him one time I had a 18-page back page of the Free Press where I was promoting our 10, 20, 40 plan at that time, and Mr. Roy said, I'm going to give you 18 back pages every Sunday. And I went to special people. I got Lee Robson in there, and I got Ben Haden. Just you name it, and I had him. But he was so humble and nice. You know, he didn't pull none of that big wheel stuff to you. He was just a humble, down-to-earth guy. And I love to hear him on his program now where he says, he'll start off, and then he says, let's talk about it.
Let's talk about it.
And that's pretty popular.
There are two phrases that most people know Ben Haden for. The first phrase, let's talk about it, and then the second phrase is a little more volume, please, sir. Because right when he starts his sermon, a lot of times they won't have his volume there in the auditorium turned up enough. I bet I've heard him 200 times say, a little more volume, please, sir, and he gets ribbed about that. It's sort of a little funny thing.
I remember he preached Roy McDonald's funeral, and he did a great job.
You know, we carried that on WDOD, and I was sitting there listening to that message, and he mentioned my name, and he mentioned our program, because when Mr. Roy passed away, I opened up the telephone lines and asked people to call in. In fact, I believe you were one of the participants. I asked people to call in with their favorite Roy McDonald stories, and he mentioned that in the eulogy that he delivered for Mr. McDonald.
You know, Earl, I want to tell you another thing. From a political standpoint, I've never heard any political person in all my career and in my time at the newspaper criticize you. You know, when you're in politics, people call you and they want you to come on the program, and some of them will just tear you up. I mean, they bring up things that you hadn't even thought about, make you look bad. I've been on your program, I know 42 times on Sound Off, which I was honored to do, and I don't remember how many times in the daytime. But you was always fair. You asked a good, honest question. Whatever the subject was in the week, that week in the paper, maybe a big flare-up, something bad going on, you'd ask me, but you didn't try to force your opinion. You just asked me my opinion, talk to me. Of course, the callers called in, and some of them were real nice, and some of them was real mean, but you handled them all just real professional, which is good, because in public office, and I think that, say, a radio man in a way is the same way as a political person. He's a public servant. People's listening to him, they count on him, they give him the facts. But you was always as good as better than anybody I ever dealt with, and I've dealt with all of them.
I've got a check in here for you, so don't let me forget to give you that check when you leave. Those are nice things you're saying, you know. Thank you so much. I couldn't have written it any better myself.
Well, you know, you was always good on the program on Sunday morning.
Well, think of this. You're sitting there interviewing the Curtis Adams, the Bobby Woods, the Gene Roberts, the Bob Corkers, or maybe you're interviewing an entertainer. Your listeners know what you think because they listen to you every day, and they have plenty of opportunities when it's just you and the listener. But they don't know what the person being interviewed thinks about a particular issue. Or maybe they know a little bit about it, but they're depending upon me, the host, to ask the questions to try to pull out those interesting facts that make that conversation appealing. So when I'm sitting there talking to somebody, like when I interviewed you, I wanted to pick your brain and find out what you knew about a particular subject, whether it was taxation, whether it was buying a building. I know we had a lot of conversations about way before the county and the city were involved in getting the land out there at the volunteer ammunition plant where Volkswagen located.
Yeah.
And, a lot of times you find out things that you don't know. So that was always my philosophy on the talk show. And I tried to even if I did not agree with somebody, that wasn't the purpose of the program. The purpose of the program was to try to get to the bottom of the subject, to find out why something's going on and who's involved.
Well, you of course, in all those times I was on your program, you didn't always agree, but you wasn't disagreeable. You would say, well, what do you think about this, Commissioner? Did you give some thought to so-and-so? And we'd get the subject over here on something else. Mm-hmm. But we got the subject out, but you was never rude. And I've been on a lot of talk shows, and their goal was to make you look bad, I can tell you.
Well, I'm not one of those that was trying to really make a name for myself, because I am what I am, and people listen to me for the type of program that I presented. And I was very proud that when I quit talk radio there at WDOD, I don't know of any person that refused to be on my program. Now, I had a little trouble at one time with District Attorney Gary Gerbitz. I kept calling him, and I said, come on, Gary, you can come down and be on my program. He was so nice to me when I'd go to the courthouse. If he saw me in the hall, he'd invite me into his office and have coffee. How you doing? I mean, really a gentleman and a good conversationalist. But he shied away from doing a talk show. So one day there was a subject come up about some legislation that he was interested in Nashville, and I called him up and I said, Gary, you're interested in that particular piece of legislation, aren't you? He said, yes. I said, this is the opportunity. Come on to Sound Off. He said, yeah, but those people are liable to ask me something. I said, look, all you have to do is say, look, I can't talk about that because it's in litigation, or we have court proceedings, that are upcoming. I can't discuss that. That's all you have to say. And I said, as host, I'll steer the bus, and I says, we'll move past that topic. And I thought I was pretty good at that, because there's some subjects that your guest can't talk about because of litigation and lawsuits and things like that. But Gary Gerbitz finally consented, and he was on Sound Off. And I don't know of anybody that I ever invited to be on Sound Off for my daily talk program that didn't accept the invitation, because even you remember Dr. Harry Reynolds, who was school superintendent. Oh, man, it was so hard to get him to be on my program. Well, Eddie Robertson was on the school board, and Eddie and I were very good friends. And Eddie says, how come you don't ever have the superintendent on? I said, I've tried, but he doesn't want to come. Eddie says, let me work on it. Well, Eddie got Dr. Reynolds to concede to come on the program. So he was there, and after it was over, he said, you get in touch with my secretary here in several months, I'll be back. Said, you really make me feel good. You don't try to embarrass me. And he came back. He was on the second time. So, my objective was to make my guest feel as comfortable as possible, but at the same time, try to find out, as much as I can about the topic that they're involved in.
Well, you were always good, Earl, and that meant a lot. I know people David Carroll is a good example. David Carroll might call you on the telephone and say, I want to come out and talk to you. And he's tell you on the phone what he wanted to talk to you about. Well, it made the interview a lot better, because, when you got there, if it was information I didn't have in my mind, I'd have something in front of me I could talk about it.
Yeah.
David was very fair, always fair. I appreciate those kind of people, and some would try to catch you off guard, as you come down the steps of the courthouse leaving.
You know how I got started doing talk radio? It's back in 1974. I just gotten home out of the Army, and I don't know why it is, but I've always had a program on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember when I have not been on Sunday morning in some shape, form, or fashion. Even when I was at the American Forces Radio Network, I had a program on Sunday morning. Well, Bill Nash came into the studio one day, and he said, this energy crisis that President Nixon is talking about, he's just ordered that the speed limits be reduced on the freeways to 55 miles an hour, and also that we will go on daylight saving time this coming Sunday. He said, Sunday morning, I want you to get on the air when you normally play music. This was between the church services. And he said, just ask the question, what do you think about the changes that President Nixon has made in order to try to conserve energy? So I did. And we had 3 telephone lines. And the entire time that I was on the air, I couldn't take all the telephone calls. The next Monday, I guess it was Monday morning, Bill came into the office and he said, "You're going to start a Sunday morning talk show." I said, "I am?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Do you have a title?" Well, occasionally I got to hear WSB in Atlanta, and their talk show was called Sound Off. And I said, "How about Sound Off?" He said, "That sounds good." Said, "They'll never know we stole the name from them." Well, there's a Sound Off in just about every city. Knoxville stole it from us, by the way. So that was how that Sound Off was born. And I would take timely topics, whatever, was on the front page of the paper the past week, try to get a guest and bring them into the studio. Or if I didn't have a guest, I'd just sit there and, jaw with the listeners. But it became a very popular program. And at one time, we had probably 2/3 of the radio audience on Sunday morning. I remember one Sunday morning, Curtis, I don't know whether you put a bug in my ear about this or not, but the heat, something happened to the heat out at the Hamilton County Nursing Home.
Yeah.
And they didn't have power or something, but somebody called me. It was either you or Dickie Matthews, but you had a relative. I don't remember what caused me to pick up the topic. But when I came on the air on Sound Off, I said, "Folks," I said, "we've got about 200 people out there that do not have heat at the Hamilton County Nursing Home." I said, "We need about 6 or 8 pickup trucks." And I said, "We need a specific point where that people can take heaters and take those out there to the nursing home." By 11 o'clock, we had heat in just about every part of that nursing home because of the good folk that listened to the Sound Off.
Yeah.
I mean, those were the types of things that I really enjoy doing. And I don't remember all the details, but I remember that Doak Cage, who was the administrator at that time, was very grateful. And they got, after the problem was resolved, they got all those heaters that they'd borrowed back to the people that had loaned them to them. So, Chattanooga's got a giving heart, and that was one example of how that they gave to their community.
There was a great audience out there on that Sound Off. I don't know how you'd rate it, but I would know it's tops in the morning.
Well, most stations had recorded material on Sunday morning. Sunday morning is throwaway time.
Yeah.
And no one is live on Sunday morning. And so I was the only live game in town.
Yeah.
And so people would tell me all the time, "Well, I'm late to Sunday school because I'm sitting there listening to you argue with Curtis Adams, or I'm sitting there listening to you argue with Bill Hullander," or whatever. I mean, people would tell me that all the time. It's a very popular program.
Yeah, and one good thing about it, if something was going on real hot during the week, that's when you call me. You call other people, I don't mean just me, but you knew what the subject were and how hot it was, and that's the reason you made a good program out of it, because it was still fresh on everybody's mind. And when you came on, I'd come on the radio, and people would be real mad about something. And I know one time we had big stories about the prison over at Silverdale and how much it cost and all that. Well, this guy called me on Sound Off, and he just ate me up alive because we didn't make those prisoners work. He just thought it was terrible. They sat around and watched television. Well, I was trying to explain to him, and he didn't agree with anything I said. And I'd always say this, Earl, if you remember. I'd say this: "I'm going to give you my home number. You call me after church. I'll be home 1 or 2 o'clock after I go out to eat. I'll be glad to talk to you." Well, this guy called me. He was on my answer machine when I came home from church, and I called him and explained to him some of the regulations that the federal people had on us as far as prisoners. We couldn't just say, "Get on the bus," like Cool Hand Luke. You remember that movie?
Yeah.
We couldn't do that now. We couldn't say, "Get on the bus, you're going out to cut grass." We asked for volunteers. That's who we had out there working. And when I explained it a little bit more, he got real friendly, and then he laughed and he said, "Mr. Adams, I know you. I'm your mailman."
That's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, he said, "I'm your mailman." Yeah. And I knew him, but he never did to give us his name. But it was an interesting program, and we don't have anything like that now.
Well, we would do some silly things on the program too. For instance, on Mother's Day, Bill Hullander would come over, and we'd call mothers out of town. Mm-hmm. And I remember one Sunday morning we got a hold of this lady. I accidentally, I guess, dialed the wrong number, but she was out on her sun deck sunbathing down in Florida somewhere. And you know how Bill carries on with some of his foolishness. He had a lot of fun with that lady. But we would call mothers. And you can't do that today because of so many prank telephone calls. But, 20, 30 years ago, why you could call somebody up and people would tell me, like, they would call in and I'd say, tell me something about your mother. Well, she likes sewing or she's into baseball or something. And I'd call up some mother and say, hey, Mary, you want to go see the Braves play this afternoon? If it's somebody in Atlanta, she'd say, who is this? And they'd sit there and they'd try to figure it out. We had a lot of fun. We really did.
I first, I met Bill Hulliner on your program. I didn't know him. Bill Hulliner. I just hear him call you. Funniest sounding guy I've ever heard in my life. I never met him, never heard of him. And he come on and talk about what he's having out at Abson. He had the Abson Hotel, 10-story hotel. Had that big fun thing over there with the gigging and all that. You remember? And that's when I first started hearing him.
Well, you remember we used to talk about the traffic light that only had a green and red light?
Yeah.
He'd have people go out there and try to find it. I mean, they thought there really was a traffic light in downtown Appleton that only had a green and red light.
I remember one time he was telling you about what all he had planned for that next week.
Oh, yeah. Well, what we would do is, like, if Riverbend was in town,
that was when he was talking.
Something would be going on.
Well, he was telling you what all he was doing. You said, wait a minute, Bill, next week is Riverbend. And real long pause, and he said, oh, you mean they're going ahead with that? Just like it was a little minor thing. Anyway, we had some great days on that early program, and we have got a lot to talk about. We're going to do this 2 times. You're going to be on there. We're going to have 2 30-minute broadcasts on this thing.
We are?
2 weeks in a row, because we got so many things to talk about. One other thing now, we've talked about when you first started and all that, and it was really good. I want to talk about some things that happened to you down through the years. One that really comes to mind is when you had Minnie Pearl on your program. Not only on the program, you had her practically all day.
That was back, I guess, in 1969. There was a big drive on here in Chattanooga to raise money and raise awareness for the disease of cancer. You remember Farrell Fay, the daughter of Judge Finkelstein?
Yes.
Farrell Fay called me, and she said, we want to do something to help the Cancer Society. And said, if your station would be interested, I'll get your headliner down here, which you've probably heard of from the Grand Ole Opry, Minnie Pearl. I said, oh, Farrell Fay, I would love you for that. So I went to the manager, and I asked the manager, I said, they're interested in doing a cancer drive here, and they'll bring in Minnie Pearl. So we worked out all the details. The collection points were the Red Food stores. It was Red Food store back then. So you could take your check by any Red Food store and make it out to the American Cancer Society. So we started about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I think we went to 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. We got a big old funeral home tent and set up out front of the radio station, and we invited anybody and everybody in politics to come in and be on that program. Well, Minnie Pearl, Farrell Fay brought Minnie Pearl in probably about 10:30, and she stayed with us for at least 5 or 6 hours just asking people to give to the American Cancer Society. And I don't know who made that picture. But I stood up by Minnie Pearl and had that picture made with her, and I didn't really realize that there was a picture out there till one day it surfaced. Somebody brought this picture. Said, "Would you like?" I said, "Yeah, that was at the cancer drive event that we had back in the late '60s for the station." I don't know whether you remember Red Brown or not, but it was so funny. Red sat there probably with Minnie Pearl for about 30 minutes, and he was Cousin Clem back in the in the old days of radio, and he sat there and he played the role of Uncle Fudd and Cousin Clem, and Minnie Pearl, was Minnie Pearl and told her stories about Uncle Nabob, and they would going back and forth, and we were standing there laughing. We were laughing our socks off. I mean, it was the funniest thing in the world. But I never will forget that day with Minnie Pearl in front of the radio station and raising money for the Cancer Society.
Well, she was an interesting lady.
Oh,
intelligent,
so interesting.
intelligent.
And we raised thousands of dollars for the cancer drive here in Chattanooga. And even after she went back to Nashville, she would send me a note every now and then saying, "I really appreciated my day in Chattanooga."
But I'd like to get to know you. Yes, I would. But I'd like to get to know you if I could. But I'd like to get to know
You was recognized in Nashville by Jimmy Nafee. I've got a proclamation he gave you up there. And
State Representative Richard Floyd called me one day, and he said, this was in 2007, I believe, 2007.
Yeah.
And he said, I want you to come, and I want you to be the chaplain of the day before the legislature. I said, Richard, there are plenty of other people that could come to the General Assembly and offer the invocation. He said, no, I want you. And so I said, are you sure? I mean, I tried to talk him out of it because, I mean, you mentioned pastors and important people that, much more name recognition than me. Well, anyway, Julie and Mark and some of the other family members, we all go to Nashville, and Richard rolls out the red carpet. And it comes time for the General Assembly to convene. So Richard says, now you need to go down, I guess they call it the well. Is that what they call it? Says you need to go up there, and said Mr. Nafee's assistant, Speaker Nafee, his assistant will tell you what to do. So they gave me instructions, and they introduced me, and I just prayed. I prayed a prayer for the deliberations there in Nashville, prayed for our country, and I remember there was a young man in our church that had just been wounded overseas, and I guess it was Iraq, and I prayed for him. And after it was over with, Jimmy Nafee called on the clerk to do something, and he came up and shook my hand, and he said, thank you so much for coming up and offering prayer before the General Assembly today. We really, really appreciate that. And he said, we have all of these important people from time to time, chaplains and things like that, but said it's always good to have a layman to come into the General Assembly. And I never will forget that day. That was truly an honor.
It
was a big honor.
Earl,
it was a big honor.
You need to think about framing this kind of stuff for your grandkids.
Well, I've got that in a frame.
I mean, that's a beautiful proclamation.
That's the one. That's the one I give people like you, so you can read that at night when you don't have anything else to read.
And another one that I wanted to mention was a tribute to Earl Freudenberg from Zach Wump in 1995 in the House of Representatives.
The phone rang one afternoon, and it was Helen Haden, and she says, hold the phone for Congressman Wump. I said, okay. And he comes on the phone. He says, Earl, Zach Wump. He says, I want to recognize you, but I want you to come to Washington. And I thought, man alive, Congressman, there's so many people down here that you could recognize. Why me? He said, well, I want to recognize you. So I talked it over with Julie, and we robbed the piggy bank to come up with a few coins, and Helen got us a room, so we took off and we went to Washington. And there's a video. If you Google my name, you can watch what Zach read about me on the internet. And I was so honored. He took us around, and I met Senator Kennedy, met Bob Dole was Speaker of the Senate back then, and just met so many people. And we sat up. There was a joint session of Congress dealing with the military, and we sat up in the back in a special section that Congressman Wump had reserved for Julie and myself. I never will forget it. And it was truly an honor. But the thing is, there were only, I think it was 2 or maybe 3 people that Congressman Wump actually took to the floor of the House and recognized during his time in Washington. The other person was Congresswoman Lloyd's husband, Joe Bucard.
Yeah.
You remember Joe Bucard?
Yeah.
He recognized Mr. Bucard for his accomplishments in the district, but that was truly an honor.
Well, I'd like to read just a little bit. It's long, but I'd like to read a little bit of it. This is Zach Wump speaking. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commend a man who has made unique and valuable contributions in his chosen calling, radio broadcast journalism, and to the community as a whole in Chattanooga and the 3rd District of Tennessee, which I have the honor to represent. In many ways, Earl Freudenberg is a perfect example of how to get ahead and better yourself in America. He started early, worked hard, and moved up the ranks quickly. But Earl Freudenberg is not the kind of man who would be content simply bettering his own life. Throughout his life, Earl Freudenberg has served as a fine example of the doer and the joiner who pitches in and helps out on all matters of worthy community projects. Earl got his feet wet in broadcasting when he was buried in his teens. While still at Northside Junior High School in Chattanooga, Earl helped out at WAPO Radio in Chattanooga by pulling copy off the wire machine to help the sportscaster broadcast road games scores for the Chattanooga Lookouts. As a junior at Kirkman High School in Chattanooga, Earl wrote advertising copy for WAPO, and later he operated the control board at the station. Goes on to talk about when you graduated and your first job, and you was about 16 years old. But there's a long proclamation from Zach Wump, and I really am proud to mention that on my show. You've had some real honors, and then the American Armed Forces Network, Earl. I don't think there's probably anybody in Chattanooga been involved with that you know about.
I have tried to find others in the Chattanooga area that was stationed with AFN, and I have not been able to. Interesting story about how I got that job. It was November of 1970, and I signed up to keep from being drafted. Went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, spent some time down there. In fact, Amy was born at Fort Jackson. Well, after Amy's birth, I got orders to Vietnam. Well, I flew out to Oakland, California, and got to go see the Oakland A's, by the way. And it was on a Thursday afternoon, been there 4 days, and they told us we were going to have formation. And I remember they started calling out names, and it was a letter from President Richard Nixon. And your commander-in-chief is thanking you for your service to the military, but you'll not be needed in Vietnam. You have been diverted to Germany. And I said, thank you, Lord. And they asked me, said, do you need to go to finance now to get some money? I said, no, I've got my wife's credit card in my back pocket. I said, I can buy a plane ticket back to Chattanooga, and I will call my wife, and they will meet me in Atlanta tonight. And I says, everything is fine. So I came back home to Chattanooga, spent another couple of weeks at home on leave, and then went to Fort Dix and flew to Germany. Well, they sent me down to Heidelberg, Germany. And it was over a holiday weekend, so I had a lot of time there at Heidelberg, and just did nothing, really, piddled around the library. But on a Tuesday morning, I reported into my new duty station, and this sergeant saw that I had 4, 5, 6 years of broadcast experience. He says here that you were program director at WDOD. I said, yes, my general manager, Bill Nash, had given me that title about 2 years before I joined the Army. So he says, just a minute. He picks up the phone and he calls back up to the network there at Frankfurt, talked to the warrant officer, Mr. Moore. Said, Mr. Moore, I got a young man here that looks like he's got some experience, and could you use him? And Mr. Moore says, oh, yes. Says, yes, if he's got some experience, we definitely can use him. So the sergeant called the colonel and said, are you using your car? He said, no, I'm not. Said, you got a driver? Said, yes, sir. He's just sitting here reading comic books. So the sergeant told me, says, is your duffel bag packed? I said, yes, sir, it's packed. He said, meet the colonel's driver down at the front gate. They're going to take you back up to Frankfurt. So here we go back up to Frankfurt, Germany. I'm riding in the colonel's place, Curtis. I mean, yeah. I felt really honored about that. So we pull up to the American Forces Network there in Frankfurt, which was next to the German broadcasting station, and I look up at this big building, and I said, wow. So I go in, and tell the person there at the front desk who I am. So they took me to the office, and I met Mr. Moore, and I told him, thank you for inviting me to come to his company. He said, there's a sergeant that you need to go see, and said, when you get finished talking to the sergeant who will brief you on what your responsibilities and everything are going to be, said, you come back up here and I'll process some paperwork. So I went to see this sergeant, and he handed me a big, thick booklet. I guess it was about 30 sheets. And he said, I want you to go down to the studio. I'm going to get somebody to go down there with you, and I want you to take this announcing test. Okay, I'll do that. Well, I looked at the front page, and it was all of these classical names. I couldn't pronounce those names. I didn't know anything about Tchaikovsky and Schubert and Chopin and all that stuff. I said, Sergeant, there's not even any reason for me to try to read this. I said, back where I come from, we know how to pronounce Buck Owens and Roy Acuff and Jim Reeves and Eddie Arnold. He starts laughing real big. He said, I'm from Kingsport. Said, you're from Chattanooga. Said, I just wanted to have a little fun with a fellow Tennessean. So he told me, he said, we'll find you a studio and let you do us a demo for your country show that you're going to be doing. So I ended up doing a country show every morning on the American Forces Network, and did that for the entire time that I was stationed there in Germany, among other responsibilities.
You had a big audience, too, didn't you? What was the people listening? Who was listening?
Oh, it wasn't many.
Soldiers.
It wasn't many people, just 21 million.
That's what I mean.
20. I mean, I would open the microphone and I would think to myself, there's the potential of 21 million people listening to this broadcast. And, I was on every morning from 5 to 6, but the military reveille was about 4:30. I mean, they started serving meals about 4:30. And, of course, the American Forces Network provided the English language. I mean, there were other broadcast stations, but they were other languages. We were the only station in English, so we had a captive audience. But we had a lot of locals too. I mean, people throughout Europe. I got mail from Belgium. I got mail from France. I even had a young girl. She was 17 years old that lived in England that woke up every morning and listened to my program while she was milking her cows.
Now, what kind of music did you play then?
Country music. Country music.
Let me read this. United States Army, American Forces Network, Europe. To all who shall see these present greetings, be it known that Sergeant, Specialist 4, Luther E. Freudenberg. I bet a lot of people never knew your name was Luther. I just heard that.
My mother named me after the man.
I didn't know. I never, as long as I've been knowing you, I never thought about that, Earl. Luther Earl Freudenberg.
That's it.
Is awarded this scroll in appreciation for exceptional and distinguished service with the Armed Forces Network Europe during the period October 21, 1972 to November 1973. I want to read one line. During this cited period, he served as producer, host of the radio show Town and Country. He received more fan mail than any other locally produced show. Now, that's pretty strong. When you say, I would say that when you receive more mail, that means you're the most popular guy on radio.
Well, the people love country music over there. I mean, they liked other forms of music too, but country music was very popular, and it was, it was a little bit of Americana from home to the troops.
I wanted to read a few things here, Earl, that you've been involved with. I know a lot about them. I know you've been involved with a lot of them. You made the Forgotten Child Fund. You was involved with that for 30 years.
Let me tell you how that all started.
Yeah.
The first year I was at WDOD in 1965, it was December, about the second or third Sunday in December. Ray Hobbs came into the studio about 10 minutes after 11. I had first prez on, the church service on, and we go back on with country music at noon. He came back in and he says, in a few minutes, there's going to be a bunch of police and firemen coming over here, and we're going to start raising money for the Forgotten Child Fund. I was okay. He said, I'm stretching this big microphone out in front of the station, and I'll go out there and you play the records and just turn the microphone on, like we do a remote. I said, yeah, Ray, no problem. So we started that at noon. About 3:30, Ray come back into the station. I mean, it was cold, it was wet, it was rainy. I mean, it was awful weather. But people were coming by, opening up their pocketbooks. Ray came in, he says, you got the feel of this thing now. Said, I'm going to play the records, and you go out front, and you start telling people, you freeze your, hiney off a little bit. So I went out in front of the radio station, and for, the remainder of the afternoon until it got dark, I started asking people to come and give money to the Forgotten Child Fund. Well, after that campaign was over with, it was early January, and I got a call from some of the police officers, Captain Vandegrift and Captain Bettis and Chief Wilkerson, Chief Bullard, and they all on a conference phone and said, "Hey, we want you to come and join the board of directors for the Forgotten Child Fund. We want you to help us out." I said, "I'd be honored to." Said, "We were impressed with what you did on that first broadcast there right before Christmas," and said, "We want you to come help us." So that started that 30-year adventure with the Forgotten Child Fund, and we raised a lot of money.
One that I remember real well, I was there at the radio station over next to Baylor School. We had something going, and you was on the air, and I remember I got pictures of me and Hollander and Zach Wump that day, and
we had a barbecue in front of the radio station.
It was real cold that day.
Yeah, we had a barbecue. We had Jay Craven and Jim Wilson and his little combo came out and play.
Yeah.
Frank McDonald and Fletcher Bright and the
Frank
Dismembers
came over that day. He was in a wheelchair.
He sure was.
Yeah.
He sure was. And we had live music. It's about 25 degrees.
Yeah.
You and Zach and Hollander were back there dishing up the barbecue, and people were coming in bringing donations. I think we raised about $10,000.
I remember that, Earl, and
it was a lot of fun.
I remember how my heart went out to Frank McDonald. He's out there like the rest of us, freezing.
But he had fun.
He
had. So I interviewed him, and he says, "I'm having more fun than a mama with a newborn baby."
And another thing, a place where we crossed paths some was the Armed Forces Week Committee. You was on that thing.
I got a story about that.
20 years.
Well, actually, it was right at 30 years, I think. When I came home from the Army, I got a call after Christmas from Jerry Lingerfeld. And Jerry didn't ask me. Jerry told me, he said, "I have been the announcer and serving on the Armed Forces Committee for a long time now." And he said, "You're just out of the Army. You're a fresh guy." He said, "You're going to take my place." And I said, "I am?" He said, "Yeah." He didn't ask me, Curtis. He just, he was very jovial about it. And I said, I love the military. I would do anything to help promote military issues. So I started as the Armed Forces Day announcer, and then went on the committee, and I served with that organization up until, I guess it was 2005 or 2006 when Mother got sick and I couldn't do it anymore. But that was a great time. My favorite time was when we bring the chaplains in on Thursday, because I'd get to go to the chaplains' luncheon at the Reed House and hear what the chaplains, they would go to the schools Thursday morning, and then they would come back and we would have a nice lunch. And then we would go over to the Warner Park Field House where the kids were making the floats. And we would always, let the Free Press in on the float making a little bit early, and they would have a float on the front page of the paper on Friday while the parade was going on. And people asked me, "Well, how do they get that picture so fast?" I said, "They're just good." But we would make those pictures, the afternoon before. But that was really an honor to serve on that committee, the Armed Forces Week Committee. And I'm glad the parade and activities are still going on today.
Me too. And you was a deacon and elder at the Independent Presbyterian Church for 5 years, WTCI volunteer fundraiser.
Walter Alley, who was the first... the state of Tennessee used to fund Channel 45, and the state of Tennessee stopped funding it and threw it back to the communities. I believe the county and city gave them a little money there for a while. Walter Alley called me one day, and he said, "I would like for you to serve on this inaugural committee. We're going independent." And he said, "You've been in fundraiser before, and you've done this type of thing," and says, "We'd like to pick your brain." So I worked with him a couple of years in the early days of when, it became a local committee.
He was also a member of the Sertoma Club.
That was pre-Army days.
White Oak PTA.
Life member, yeah.
Freedom Foundation Appreciation Award 2005.
Dr. DeZeke, Dr. Joe DeZeke, he called me one day and he says, "Earl," he said, "I'm going to nominate you for the Freedom Foundation Award for the Chattanooga Sertoma Club." I said, "Joe," I said, "there's plenty of people out there." He said, "I'm going to nominate you." I said, "Okay." So I got a free meal.
Here's a great one, Earl. Tennessee Associated Press Broadcaster of the Year, 1980 to 81.
I can't remember who nominated me for that. But I was very, very honored because that was an award that was given statewide, and that was broadcasters, in East, Middle, and West Tennessee.
And then the Red Bank Chamber of Commerce Person of the Year in 1988.
Yeah, the late Betty Heffington. Betty just died here a few weeks ago.
I knew her well.
Betty put my name up for that.
Satoma Club Service to Mankind Award in 1999. Military Order of Purple Heart Citation 2000. One thing I want to ask you about, too, I know you had an opportunity to meet a lot of famous people, and in 1980, you got to meet Walter Cronkite and Andy Rooney in Wisconsin. Tell us about that.
Was that 1980? I can't remember exactly the year.
1980.
Well, the journalist here in Chattanooga elected me president of the Journalistic Society. And it was, I guess they couldn't find anybody else the second term, so they gave me 2 terms, and they wanted me to go to the national convention. And there were people on that, that were a member of SDX, people in TV and radio, and Irby Park. You remember Irby Park from over at the Free Press. And I said, send Irby. I said, he's a much more accomplished journalist than me. And Irby says, Earl, we want you to go. And they raised the money. They bought my plane ticket up there and back, paid for my room, and I really felt that was an honor. But it was a year when the CBS personalities had a lot to do with the convention. So Walter Cronkite was there, Eric Severoid, and Andy Rooney was our featured speaker. And I remember we were going through the receiving line, and Walter Cronkite standing there, and I shook his hand, told him who I was and where I was from. And you'll never guess, Chattanooga. Oh yeah, the choo-choo. And he says, I know all about the choo-choo train. So that's what we're known for.
One other thing I want to touch on in the last few minutes. I don't know exactly how this evolved, but you are also known as the gospel music pro. You know all the gospel music people. You've been involved with gospel music for years. Tell us a little bit how you got started and how that thing. I mean, everybody, I hear them on your program, the well-known people in gospel music promoting WDOD-AM. How did you get so involved with gospel music and the kind of music you play? People love it. How did you get started with that?
I got hired at WDOD in June of 1965, right out of graduation. And I started over there on a Saturday, and I worked a little bit on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Well, on Sunday morning, I think it started at 5 o'clock up until we started the church programs, which was about 8 o'clock. I played gospel music and didn't know a thing about it. I mean, I knew who the Chuck Wagon Gang was. I knew who the Spear family was. Well, I borrowed albums from Gwen Cofield. Gwen would come over on Saturday and do a program there at the station, and I would say, Gwen, can you loan me a dozen or so albums so that and pick me out some songs there? So I played gospel music on Sunday morning, my very, very first weekend to work there at WDOD. And in some shape or form, I've been playing gospel music just about ever since. I know that in, I guess it was 1968 or 1969, Bill Nash and myself were on the way up to Lenore City, Tennessee, to do a basketball game. And I just had an FM radio put in my car. And he was tuning up and down the dial, and he said, listening to FM reminds me of eating beans, string beans. And I said, you mean there's too much violin music on there? He said, we're going to break that tradition. We're going to do something different with our FM. I said, what? He said, well, do you have any ideas? And just, off the top of my head, I said, well, let's play gospel music. He said, Monday morning, you're going to start a gospel music show. I said, well, Bill, I got to have some time to get some records. He said, okay. Said, a week from Monday, we're going to start a gospel music show at 9 o'clock, and you're going to do it, and it's going to be called Dixie Camp Meeting. And did you know within 6 months, we had built an audience up on that program? I mean, they were listening all over southeast Tennessee and North Georgia. I even got mail from North Carolina. They were listening to the Dixie Camp Meeting, and we played gospel music. And they were running that program up until I went into the Army, and even after I went into the Army. And then when I came home from the Army, I don't know who it was, but somebody said, well, you've done gospel music, so you might as well do some gospel music again. And so I've been doing gospel music ever since.
Well, I've heard you call people on your program and talk to them, prominent gospel music people.
You know who has opened more doors as far as introducing me to artists? Our good friend Dickie Matthews.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Dickie Matthews has opened more doors for me than anybody I know. And when I stop and I think back of the different gospel artists that I know, it's thanks to Dickie Matthews and maybe Dickie getting me a phone number or, taking me to see somebody, or maybe Dickie's called me up many, many times and say, hey, we're going to go down to a convention, or we're going to go to a Hall of Fame meeting. You going to go with us? They used to do something right before Christmas down in Calhoun, Georgia, and a lot of these artists would be there. And then they had the old timers gospel singing up in Knoxville, and Dickie said, hey, you want to go? And of course, Dickie's just one person I really owe a lot to is Dickie Matthews, because he invited me to go to the Anthony Berger funeral, and that's where I met so many of the artists. Larry Ford, we play a lot of his music here on the station. Different artists were there, and James Black. Let's see, James Blackwood wasn't at Anthony's funeral, but Bill Gaither, Dickie introduced me to Bill. Of course, I had talked to Bill Gaither before, but he didn't remember me. But Dickie introduced me to Bill Gaither back there, and we had a little conversation.
Anytime we've ever had anything pertaining to gospel music, WDYN has made it. And Earl, I tell you, it's been a real honor. This is the fastest hour I can ever remember. We've been talking for an hour, and we still hadn't covered everything. But
you don't want to tell me you don't want me to tell you my snake story?
Well, we don't have time.
Oh, okay.
But I want to say that it's been an honor to be able to interview you and to be part of your career too. And you was always well respected from everybody at the newspaper. Actually, before I ever met you, and I just knew you from Hey Earl. I didn't really know you, and so we've really had a great relationship. And then we've been great friends for years. And I've had an opportunity to be on WDYN's Share-a-thons with you, and then you asked me to do this program, and it's been great. This is about the 30th or 31st interview I've had. I've had some great people. I thank you so much for taking your time today.
My feelings are hurt that you don't want to hear my snake story.
Well, I'd like to hear it later. We only got 1 minute left, and you got 1 minute to say something.
Oh, it's been a great adventure, 50 years of fun. There's been a lot of bumps in the road, but, for every valley there's a mountain, as somebody said.
I think you deserve a lot. We appreciate what you meant to Chattanooga, and thank you so much for being on my program.
Thank you, Curtis.
Getting to know you, getting to know all about you, getting to like you, getting to hope you like me.
The very first day that I went to work at WDOD, I got there about 10 minutes after 8. It's Saturday morning. The chief engineer was Gene Lando. He says, now we have a lot of power outages out here on the river. So we got a generator downstairs, and you're going to have to be able to go down and crank the generator up. He says, if you get down here when the power goes out, you can have the station back on the air in a couple of minutes, and nobody will know the difference. They'll just, think the record ran out and you've been in the bathroom. So I said, okay, let's go learn how to turn the generator on. We went downstairs, we opened up the generator room, and there was this big old rattlesnake that was coiled up. I mean, that was a big old sucker. And I said, how in the world are we going to escape this? There was one of these big old large music stands from back in the days when they had live shows over in the Hamilton Bank building. And that music stand was just inside the transmitter room door. Gene took that music stand, he said, step back. And he set that music stand right down on that rattlesnake and cut it into about 12 pieces. From then on, every time I went down to turn the generator on, I got the flashlight.
Yeah.
And I looked around to make sure there wasn't any snakes coiled up. My philosophy was, don't try to trap whoever your guest is because you want them to come back.
Yeah.
So apparently it worked. How many times did you say you was on that
42 on
program?
Sunday morning in 22 years.
Oh.